Hello, Oceanside Collegiate Academy. It's Mr. Muma again, welcoming you back for another exciting U.S. history video. Today we're going to be talking about the early republic. We're going to be talking about the United States as it came into being, both under the Articles of Confederation and under the U.S. Constitution that we still live under today. We're going to be focusing on how those developed. We're going to be focusing on the early presidencies, a little bit on Washington, a little bit on Adams, but mostly on Jefferson. A lot of really exciting things happening when Jefferson's president, so we'll get into that a lot. Well, let's dive right in. I've been working on cutting the time on these. My initial videos were kind of long. They were like 56, 57 minutes long, which is just a little bit longer than class. So I'm trying to keep it right at between 38 and 45 minutes. So hopefully I'll be able to get this in within that time if I don't waste time like I'm doing now. So let me stop. To begin with, during the Revolutionary War, actually in 1781, the Revolutionary War is actually winding down. The Continental Congress gets together and they form a new system of government called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation form a confederation, which is to say a loose association of states. Each state is essentially still sovereign at this point. Georgia's running its own taxes, foreign policy, everything like that, as is South Carolina, as is all the other 11. So there is very little in the way of a strong central government. Now this is going to cause a lot of problems. I mean, Continental Congress already kind of a weak government. Articles of Confederation, a weak government. The central government does not have the authority to tax directly. All they can do is ask the states for money. It's very hard to keep the Continental Army paid because the states want to keep all the money they can, obviously. Every state's worried about every other state not giving its share of the money. They'd rather keep their militia in their state and pay them. And it causes a lot of problems, as we're going to see here with Shays' Rebellion in a minute. This is something that George Washington had to deal with a lot, and it really irritated him. And when the war is over and he leaves the war, one thing he's certain of is that the United States needs a stronger central government. Now, one thing the Articles of Federation government does establish, that one great accomplishment, if you could say there's one big accomplishment of the government under the Articles of Federation, it is this: the Northwest Ordinance. When the war is over, the United States now, remember that proclamation line, that is a dead letter. So Americans want to pour across the Appalachian Mountains and settle. Well, how is that process going to go? One thing you'll see in American history, we're not going to get too much into it here, but one thing you'll see is people kind of jumping the gun, taking the initiative. They go over the Appalachians, just try to make their own state. We'll see this. There's states that disappear, like Franklin in what's today Tennessee. Somebody across the border tried to make a state called Franklin. It didn't work. So Congress wants to establish an orderly process by which this happens. Northwest Ordinance is how they do that. Northwest Ordinance establishes how they're going to, basically everything here north of the Ohio River, and all the way over to Louisiana, which we talked about. How are we going to settle this? Well, colonists move in. The federal government is the only power that has any authority to deal with the Indians, to actually buy land from the Indians and interact with them in any kind of way. In other words, they don't want a bunch of private people going in, buying land from the Indians. There's disputes, there's war. The government is the only entity authorized to purchase land from Indians. All this land belongs to the federal government. It gets surveyed out, you buy it from the federal government. The federal government divides this land into territories. Once each territory reaches the population of the smallest existing state, it can petition for statehood. And this is pretty much the pattern for the settlement of the rest of the United States, other than a few odd outliers like Hawaii that just kind of gets taken over. But this is basically the pattern. As you can see, the states of Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, all these extend way farther west than they are today. Part of the reason for this we talked about the French and Indian War. Remember, the original colonial settlements was just, okay, it's this latitude, but it's all the way out to the Pacific. So it's not for a while until they finally establish, okay, here's where Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and everybody else ends, and here's where territories and new states begin. But the Northwest Ordinance, very, very important, establishes how the United States is going to expand in the future. However, that's one success and a big pile of failure. And one of the biggest failures, one of the things that just drives failure home, is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays is a farmer. He lives in western Massachusetts, aka the poor part at this time. Most of these people are subsistence farmers. They grow food just for themselves. At this point in history, we're going to talk about this when we get into market revolution, development of market economy. At this point in American history, there's not a lot of actual cash in circulation. If you live in a rural area, most of what you use is produced, you produce yourself, or you barter with a neighbor. I would just say, I've got a cow, I need some cheese, there we go. In order to pay for the Revolutionary War, to pay for all these militias and everything, the states start levying taxes on people, taxes and money. And a lot of these guys, they're farmers, they're off fighting the Revolutionary War. They come back, people like Daniel Shays, and their dang farm is on the auction block because they haven't paid their taxes. Now, Daniel Shays might have been able to pay his taxes had Congress actually paid him for his service as a Revolutionary War soldier. So Daniel Shays is looking around, he's looking around at all the other veterans. Not for the last time would a bunch of people look around and say, wow, we fought this war and didn't get much out of it. And a bunch of rich people did, but we didn't. So Daniel Shays is looking around and he's saying, I didn't even get paid. I had to leave the army basically with them owing me money, and I come home and they're confiscating my farm because I didn't pay taxes, and I couldn't pay taxes because they didn't pay me, and this is horrible and stupid. So Daniel Shays rallies a group of other former soldiers / farmers, and they just start attacking courthouses, burning tax rolls, beating up judges, stuff like that. Anybody stupid enough to show up in the western Massachusetts and actually try to collect these taxes, that's a big problem. Well, Daniel Shays has a few thousand guys behind him. And eventually this kind of snowballs into a big problem. And Massachusetts is unable to stop this. The government just cannot raise enough money to raise the militia. The federal government is unable to raise money to send an army. And what ends up happening is a bunch of rich merchants in Boston basically donate money to this general named Benjamin Lincoln, who then raises a militia with the donated money and defeats Daniel Shays and chases his men off the field. Now, that's bad. When you basically have to kick in to get an army, you're really not a sovereign state at that point. You really don't have when you don't have the power to suppress these rebellions with farmers with pit. I mean, yes, these are combat veterans. Yes, and there's a lot of them. But all the same, this is not something that it should have gotten as big as it did. But the government of Massachusetts, the federal government especially, is unable to shut this down. And that points to big problems. And thus, we get to the Constitutional Convention. Since the days of the Revolution, a lot of people are looking at this Articles of Confederation saying this is not good, this is not strong enough. We understand that these states are very jealous of their individual rights. We understand that these states were each founded as a distinct colony, that they have no national consciousness really very much yet, and that they're jealous of the powers that they have within their own states. However, not having a strong central government is causing a lot of problems. We can't put down rebellions, we can't collect taxes, every state is setting its own foreign policy, states are taxing imports from other states. This is chaotic, it's ridiculous, and we're too weak, and we're just subject to predation from foreign powers, Indians, and our own internal revolts. Now, the leaders of this, interestingly, are Washington and people who have been in the Revolutionary War, but the main guy behind this, the main architect, the main impetus for this, the guy we already talked about, Alexander Hamilton. Remember, Hamilton is Washington's right-hand man. Hamilton has dealt with all of this. The lack of pay, the lack of organization, trying to keep men in the field when they're not even sure what Congress is up to. They can't count on a steady stream of money coming in, which means they can't make plans for military operations. They don't know how many men they're going to have, that sort of thing. Hamilton has dealt with this from Washington's side. Not only that, Hamilton, we talked about, is a voracious reader. Hamilton has studied how government works in England and France, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. He studied modern economics. He knows his stuff, and Hamilton looks at this situation and says, we got a new government. Now, initially, The Convention of 1787 is called to reform the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton, though, takes the lead in basically kind of hijacking this. He's at this point a representative from New York. Takes the lead in hijacking this to turn it into a platform for creating a new system of government. In other words, we're not going to reform the Articles of Confederation. We're going to junk them and come up with something new. A lot of people are against this. And they're a little bit suspicious of Hamilton anyway. Hamilton, for one thing, unlike a lot of the, well, I can handle it a second, but they're suspicious of Hamilton, and not a lot of them initially get behind this. What helps Hamilton is, especially James Madison of Virginia, another Virginia, or a Virginian, not a New Yorker, not essentially a foreigner like Hamilton. Hamilton, along with James Madison, along with a guy named John Jay, put in a lot of work, not only getting behind this idea of the Constitution, but popularizing it. The three of them collectively write the Federalist Papers, which are a series of essays that appear under pseudonyms in newspapers across America, arguing for this Constitution as it's developing. Federalist Papers to this day are a very important source of the thinking of the Founding Fathers who were advocating this constitutional government. So eventually, people at this convention, and again I'm making a very complicated story very simple. People at this convention, they get behind this idea of a new government, scrap the Articles of Federation, let's do it. So they come up with some various plans. Two plans to know about are the Virginia Plan and New Jersey Plan. New Jersey Plan basically favors small states. In other words, how are we going to get represented in this national government? Some states are bigger than others. Are we going to go by state? Are we going to go by population? What are we going to do? New Jersey Plan favors small states. One legislature, a unicameral legislature. Every state basically gets a vote. Every state gets the same number of representatives. So little tiny Rhode Island is going to have as much of a voice in Congress as great big Pennsylvania and Virginia. Well, Virginia Plan is cooked up by James Madison. And if anybody can be said to be the founder of the Constitution, father of the Constitution, it is James Madison. James Madison from Virginia, one of these Virginia planters, like Jefferson we're going to talk about, like Washington, like all these other guys. Well, we talked about a lot of them. One of these Virginia planters, a man who is absolutely brilliant, goes off to today Princeton College, studies classics, knows his Greek, knows his Latin, actually studied Hebrew, was fluent in Hebrew, very interesting guy. A genius just like Hamilton. He comes up with this Virginia Plan. Virginia Plan basically, we're going to have, instead of going by individual states, we're going to go by population. States with the most people get the most votes in Congress, essentially, the national government. Two houses of government, one elected by the people, the other elected by the other house. In other words, it would be like if the House of Representatives elected the Senate. And then, number of congressmen determined by population, as you can see. Well, small states don't like the Virginia Plan. So Madison, they kind of cook it and deal with it a little bit. And what you end up with is the Great Compromise. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have two houses, two sides of the legislature, a bicameral system. One of them will be elected by proportional representation. In other words, every state gets a certain number based on its population. The other will have two representatives from each state regardless of size. Those representatives will be chosen by state legislatures. So in other words, you have one house where the population is chosen by the people, another house where the population is chosen by state government, and then that's how that goes. So it kind of balances out population versus, small states are happy, big states are happy, like that. Well, this is what ends up passing. The Virginia Plan in its modified form. So basically, think of the Great Compromise as Virginia Plan with a dose of New Jersey Plan, and it ends up getting passed and happened. So it goes to the voters in 1787. It has to be passed by plurality of the state, or what is it? I forget what I'm trying to say. The word escapes me, but a bunch of the states have to sign it. I think it's 3. What is it? It's going to kill me. I can't remember. I'm standing right here in front of the camera. All right, you tell me, guys. I know 11 out of 13 ratify it. Eventually, all 13 ratify it. So, it passes. 1788 it passes. 1789 it comes into effect. So, 1789 Articles of Confederation are out, and the U.S. Constitution comes into play. The U.S. Constitution remains the supreme law of the land. It is our frame of government. In other words, it sets up the system under which we live both nationally and on the state level. One other thing to mention. When they were talking about these various plans, Virginia Plan versus New Jersey, when you talk about representation, well, are we going to include slaves? The Virginia Plan people want to include slaves because, of course, in Virginia, there's lots of slaves. They don't get to vote, and for legal purposes, they're considered property, but of course, if you count them, that gives Virginia more of a voice. New Jersey Plan people, small states, mostly in the North, don't want to count slaves as being represented for purposes of apportioning congressmen. So what they end up with is something called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Each slave will count as 3/5 of a person for representational purposes. There's a lot of myths around this. So slaves were considered 3/5 of a human being. No, just for representative purposes, that's how it worked. And actually, it was the slave owners that wanted them to count as a whole person because, of course, that would increase their power. Right. So let's talk about that system of government as it developed. Okay. You guys hopefully should remember this from your Schoolhouse Rock days or Brain Pops in middle school or whatever. You have the three branches of government. You've got the legislative, you've got the executive, you've got the judicial. Legislative branch makes laws. They basically law. You know how it goes. You've all seen the "I'm Just a Bill" song from Schoolhouse Rock, or maybe you haven't. If you haven't, YouTube it. Not right now, obviously. Watch this, but then YouTube it. They pass a bill. Somebody writes a bill. They pass it. And the House of Representatives goes to the Senate. It passes there. Goes to the president. President signs it. Bam! It's a law. Simple. Making the simple version of it there, but get the idea. And of course, there's all kinds of things that happen. The president can veto it. Senate can send it back, or so on like that. The executive branch. The executive branch is the president and his cabinet and everybody who serves under the president. The president signs laws into power, vetoes laws, and basically he sort of legislature makes laws, he enforces laws. His job is to do that. Department of Justice and all that. He's not a cop or anything like that. You'll see that in older books. He enforces laws. It's a little vague in terms of how that really applies, but you can think of it that way if you want. The president is elected every 4 years by the population as a whole through the Electoral College. That's a key thing. Our presidents are not elected directly through the people. The people vote, and then the electors from each state, which are apportioned out based on how many people are in each state, decide who's the president. And then you've got the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. Now, initially, there was no mention in the Constitution how many justices there have to be. You get 5, you get 7, basically you have 9 now. But these guys are the ones who review laws. They interpret the law. They decide how a law applies in a given situation. Now, our government is not only organized in separate powers, but it's also organized on separate levels. We have in this country a federal system, which is to say, here it's a 2-tiered system of government. National government and state governments. State governments have a mirror structure to this. The chief executive in a state is, of course, the governor. Every state has a state house or a state senate or both where they pass laws. Every state has a state court system where they interpret state laws. It's a parallel and my brain not working all of a sudden. Subordinate system that mirrors the system in the national level. Now, there are some things states can do that the federal government can't. Some things federal government does, the state can't. For example, as it says here, when you actually look at this, you'll be able to zoom in a little better and see it. The states can regulate trade within the state. They set up corporations, marriage and divorce laws, establish, maintain public schools. That's how things work in the beginning, and in theory, that's how things still work to this day. When they finally passed the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. At the end, 10th Amendment says all powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people. In practice, there's very little today that the federal government does not have some kind of voice in. State governments today are very, very weak as compared to the federal government. Federal power in public schools and everywhere. It's just federal government's power has very much spread from what it was at this time. Now, one very important feature of government that's established early on in the judicial branch is this idea of judicial review. Initially, you have the legislative branch, Congress and House of Representatives, or the House of Representatives and the Senate. You have the executive branch, the president. You have the judicial branch, Supreme Court. That's the weak one. Supreme Court doesn't have a lot of power initially. And one thing that really shapes the character of these institutions are the men who hold these offices initially, because they're the ones who sort of decide how much power they're going to have, and just what they can get away with basically in the beginning is how much power they're going to have as they go along. One reason people were very suspicious of Hamilton. Hamilton was, I guess what you would call, in modern terms, sort of a reactionary. Hamilton very, very much feared the people. Hamilton did not trust the great mass of people to make good decisions. He wanted a strong central government because he feared democracy. He feared a popular voice in government. Hamilton, for example, wanted to make the executive an executive for life. He's elected, yes, but then he holds office until he dies, at which point there is another election. Hamilton had no problem with the idea of monarchy. He didn't like the British monarch in particular, but the idea of monarchy in general, he had no problem with. Had he ever become president, or had he for some reason been the first or second president, it's possible that he might have pushed it in that direction. So you can see how the character of these men can stamp things, and no better example of that than this guy, John Marshall. John Marshall is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Case comes to him. A guy named William Marbury is suing then Secretary of State James Madison because the judicial appointment didn't go through. The actual case itself isn't that really that interesting. What is interesting is that John Marshall takes this opportunity to declare a law to be unconstitutional, which is to say, Congress passed this law, but it's not in accord with the Constitution, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Therefore, this law is null and void, doesn't exist. This is the principle of judicial review. The idea that the Supreme Court can rule a law to be not a law if it does not accord with the Constitution. Had he not done this, it's possible the Supreme Court never would have, sort of, for lack of a better word, realized it had this power. So, and we're going to see with Louisiana Purchase later on with Jefferson. So can the president authorize the purchase of a basically huge foreign territory? Yes, no, maybe. Well, I'm doing it. Let's see if it works. And it did, so now they can. Now, one thing to remember when we talk about the Constitution coming into being coming into force in 1789, is that same year in France, there is a revolution, just like the American Revolution. The French government is overthrown. King Louis XVI, who had done so much to help the United States, he is basically overthrown in a revolt. The French people, it's a very long, complicated story. If you guys take Western Civ 2 with me, we'll get more into detail with it. But just know that the French people form a national assembly, essentially. They overthrow the king. They proclaim a republic in France. A lot of people in America initially think this is great. We had a revolution. They have a revolution. Wonderful. Thomas Jefferson especially gets way behind this. Then things start to go really bad and really bloody. The French government gets ever more radical. They, as you can see here, behead the king. They behead the queen. They charge them with treason. And then they just start beheading everybody. One of part of the problem with the revolution is the logic of it is that whoever's the most radical is the most revolutionary and therefore the most moral. So the people who want to change things the most have all the sort of moral weight behind them. And it gets more radical, and the French government is executing people in the thousands, blood's flowing in the streets. Anybody suspected of plotting against the new government is executed. Eventually, this kind of grinds to a halt as the people themselves who are ordering all these executions get caught up in it. They get executed. Things settle down a little bit, but the chaos is still in place. The French government is unstable. And who comes to the rescue, for lack of a better word? This guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is not a native inhabitant of France. He comes from a place called Corsica, which is an island off the coast of Italy. He comes to France in kind of a, I guess for lack of a better word, exchange program. He's a son of a minor Corsican nobleman, and France, having taken control of Corsica, they want the Corsican elite people to be loyal to France, so they take their children, bring them to France, and educate them in military school. So Napoleon goes to military school, revolution breaks out, he's a young officer, he jumps on board with it, and he's very talented. He rises very quickly through the Revolutionary Army because, as you can imagine, they're burning through people pretty quickly. He ends up being France's most powerful general, and to make, again, a very complicated story short, Napoleon comes to power, tells the version, I guess, 5 of the French government, take a hike. Napoleon proclaims himself dictator. then dictator for life, and then Emperor of France, and proceeds to take France on the warpath. This is in 1799 that Napoleon declares himself dictator, and in 1800, 1801, he's the emperor. And as you can see, the French has already been at war for about 10 years at this point with all its neighbors. Napoleon takes it on the warpath for another, essentially 15 years, and just conquers most of Europe. Everything here that's blue he controls directly. The green are his subservient allies. So everything that's happening in the early American Republic is happening in the shadow of this. Things that are happening in Europe are going to affect things that happened in America. We're going to be talking about this when we talk about the War of 1812. We're going to be talking about this when we talk about the Market Revolution. One thing, for example, Napoleon needs money. Now, we talked about Louisiana. Louisiana, there's a complicated series of exchanges where it ends up Napoleon, and again, it's kind of complicated. Napoleon ends up back in control of Louisiana. Then he sells it back to Spain. Then he invades Spain, just steals it back. So now France has Louisiana again. And Napoleon, casting around for money, says, hey, America, how would you like to buy Louisiana for $15 million? Jefferson jumps at the chance. He's not really sure if the Constitution gives him the authority to do this, to authorize Congress to buy this, get the money to buy this. But he decides it's too good an opportunity to pass up, so let's buy it and see what happens. And it turned out it worked out pretty well. So Jefferson purchases Louisiana from Napoleon for $15 million. That's a lot of money back then, but compared to what this land is actually worth now, of course, we got a huge bargain. As you can imagine, though, this really angers Napoleon's principal enemy, which is England. The British people and Napoleon have been at war since basically the French Revolution started. The British are very anti-French Revolution, just like they were very anti-American Revolution. So Thomas Jefferson has basically given Napoleon $15 million to wage war on them. So they're not very happy about that. This is one of the things that's going to spiral into the War of 1812 later on. So, the United States starts off here. Here's your Northwest Territory, Mississippi Territory, just kind of like this gets formed out of the same chunk. And now you got Louisiana. As you can see, the United States essentially doubles in size. And I say essentially doubles because we talked about this before with these boundary issues. No one's exactly sure where Louisiana ends. Very few white men have ever been out here. The only people who come out here really are fur traders and trappers, people like that who work for these fur companies who go deep into the howling wilderness as far as they're concerned. So the United States bought this land. They're not even really sure where it ends. So, Thomas Jefferson then authorizes the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, Jefferson is a very fascinating man. He's a polymath. He's another one of these geniuses the generation of the Revolution tends to produce. Born in Virginia, one of these Virginia planters, goes to William and Mary like a lot of these guys, a lot of Virginia planters. Learns his classics, learns his classical history, learns his legal theory, political science, all economics, all this stuff. But his interests are far more broad than that. Thomas Jefferson is a talented amateur architect. One thing I guess today that you'd never want to live in is a building designed by an amateur architect. But Thomas Jefferson is a brilliant architect. In fact, he designs his own home, Monticello, and spends the rest of his life designing it and pouring money he doesn't have into it. Thomas Jefferson, one thing he was not good at was money. He's a scientist. He's an ethnographer. He's very interested in the Indians, their languages, their culture, where they came from, which is a perennial mystery in America that's not really figured out until the whole Bering Land Strait theory we talked about. He's interested in botany. He's interested in biology, all of these things. And he's very interested in all of those things as they apply to this Louisiana territory. So to figure out what's there, to figure out if there's a river to get to the Pacific Ocean that we can use, to find out what kind of animals live there, what kind of plants live there, who the Indians are, to let the Indians know they're now under the rule of the United States government, all of that, Thomas Jefferson organizes the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, I know what you're thinking too, by the way, before we go on. Mr. Moomaw, you forgot to talk about the Washington administration, the Adams administration. A little bit, yes. The reason for that is a short period of time. I want to try to get through this as quickly as possible. Washington administration, the main thing to know about that is that Jefferson's his first Alexander Hamilton's his first Secretary of Treasury. Jefferson's Secretary of State ends up being replaced with John Adams. Washington's farewell address, where he urges Americans not to get involved in these foreign entanglements. John Adams, main thing to know about his administration is dealing with the fallout from this French Revolution, Alien Sedition Acts. He doesn't want people coming to America from France trying to raise armies and instigate foreign intrigue in America. Alien Sedition Acts are ruled unconstitutional. John Adams only serves one term. He's defeated by Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about those political parties when we get to the War of 1812, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, so hold on for that. But just know that this causes a bit of rift between Adams and Jefferson, too. So we already had John Adams the term also, so I don't get too into that. So just know that about them, and when I see you again, of course, you can ask me any specific questions you have. Now, Lewis and Clark expedition. Starts off here, St. Louis on the Mississippi River, and Lewis and Clark. Meriwether Lewis is an Army captain. William Clark is a second lieutenant in the Army. They get a bunch of guys together. They go upriver, essentially, up the Missouri. They were the first Americans to see the Rocky Mountains, first Americans to see the Great Plains, first Americans to realize the fall line is here, where all the rivers go this way here and that way there. They're the first Americans to realize there is no magic river that takes you all the way to the Pacific Ocean that you can just sail across. Of course, they meet famously Sacagawea. She's their guide through various encounters with various Indian tribes out west. They make it here. Four-class stop out here in Washington, which they set up. They're the first Americans to make it to the Pacific Ocean by land. And then, they turn around and go back home. Now, they leave in 1804. They get back in 1806. And most people think they died somewhere out there. People either forget about them or just don't really expect them to come back. And then they just show back up. And it's a monumental achievement of exploration. As you can imagine, Jefferson is thrilled. Jefferson then in the middle of his second term. And Louisiana becomes firmly a part of the United States. Now this down here, by the way, here's your still part of New Spain. The boundaries, you can see right here, if you look at this map versus that one, the boundaries don't look exactly the same. On this map, this kind of extends out here a little bit. This extends a little bit further down. Still a little bit vague where what ends and where what one begins. It's going to cause problems a little bit later on. Obviously, for the Spanish, the fact the United States just doubled is a big deal. Another thing to keep in mind, technically, legally speaking, Napoleon was supposed to, by the terms of the treaty by which he got Louisiana from Spain, he was supposed to offer it for sale back to Spain before he offered it for sale to anybody else. He didn't do that. He didn't offer it back to Spain before he offered it to the United States. Therefore, you could interpret that as this sale was null and void and it actually still belongs to Spain, which is going to be the position of the British when we get to the War of 1812. Another accomplishment of Jefferson's: foreign policy. When the United States comes into being, it's no longer under the protection of the British government, and United States shipping doesn't get the protections that British government, the power of the British Navy will provide for British shipping. In North Africa, there are essentially a series of pirate states all along the coast from what's today Libya all the way to what's today Morocco. These are known as the Barbary states. Technically, they're under the authority of the Ottoman Sultan over in Istanbul, but in practice, they just operate independently. Their main source of income is piracy. They attack ships on the Mediterranean, they raid the southern coast of Italy, they loot, they pillage, they take slaves who are then sold into markets in North Africa. And to not have to deal with this, most European countries just pay them tribute. In other words, here's some protection money, just don't attack any ship that has our flag. Well, the United States, Jefferson refuses to pay this. It just kind of goes against his personality. He doesn't want to pay tribute. So the pirates attack American shipping. They capture a bunch of American ships. They take people prisoner. So Jefferson authorizes a naval expedition to attack these Barbary states. Between 1801 and 1805, the U.S. Navy is active in the Mediterranean, attacking shipping, defeating them, and basically making the Mediterranean a lot more safe for shipping. This is the United States' first foreign war. It's interesting. Our first foreign war is in the North Africa, the Mediterranean region, where we're still engaged to this day. Now, I should point out that the Sultan of Morocco was one of the first countries to recognize the United States and signed a treaty of friendship with the United States. And we have been friends, very peacefully and happily, with Morocco ever since. It's one of our oldest and most successful and enduring friendship treaties, America and Morocco. Not something people talk about very much, but there you go. Morocco's our buddy. Go there if you get a chance and show them your support. Now, as we move on, and again, we talk about the War of 1812. We're going to get more into party politics. I wanted to talk today more about the structure of government and how the United States expands rather than some of the internal conflicts. We're going to talk about Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists as we move in, sort of how the Democratic Republicans evolve out of those anti-Federalists and all that. But one outcome of these political disputes that we're going to talk about next, as ramifications for next time, is the dispute between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Aaron Burr is a very interesting character. He's actually a descendant of Jonathan Edwards, the preacher from the First Great Awakening. He's a very brilliant man, college educated, very clever, fights the Revolution, actually almost dies of heat stroke at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. Goes into politics, becomes Thomas Jefferson's vice president, and in his capacity as Thomas Jefferson's vice president, gets into a dispute with the then out-of-power Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is a brilliant man, but a terrible politician. His main talent as a politician is alienating people. His own party, the Federalists, everybody pretty much comes to hate him. He and John Adams hate each other as much as Hamilton hates Thomas Jefferson, and he really hates Thomas Jefferson. Well, even though Jefferson and Burr don't like each other, Burr ends up getting into it with Hamilton. One thing about Aaron Burr, he is ambitious, ruthless, cynical, and completely amoral. He is a creature who loves power. Hamilton, when Burr runs against Jefferson for president, Burr openly supports Jefferson as opposed to Hamilton supports Jefferson over Burr. Burr resents this, and they begin a nasty series of letters to each other, which culminate in Burr calling Hamilton out for a duel. Now, Hamilton is a guy, because he's sort of moved up in the world very quickly, he's kind of insecure. He's got a hair-trigger temper anyway. He's perfectly happy to get in somebody's face and wave a pistol and all that. So Hamilton accepts the duel, goes out to a place called Weehawken, New Jersey, where he and Burr stand face to face with each other. The second says, present. Each of them raises a pistol and fires. Hamilton's gun goes off wildly while Burr just takes careful aim and shoots Hamilton into the liver. Hamilton dies in agony later on, having basically died for nothing at the age of 49, leaving behind a grieving wife and many children. Burr's political career is severely injured by this. It's going to get even worse later on. We're going to talk about Aaron Burr deciding to try to... But we'll get into that. It's funny. Burr conspiracy. Right. So, understand this, guys. Articles of Confederation don't work. Central government's power is too limited. Shays' Rebellion illustrates that. Constitutional Convention in 1787, you get people like Alexander Hamilton, seen here getting shot. Alexander Hamilton advocating for a strong, powerful central government, actually much less strong than what he would have preferred. Constitution comes into effect in 1789, separation of powers, legislative, executive, judicial. Federalism, 2 tiers of government, national government and state government, each of which, at least in theory, have separate and distinct spheres of authority. Remember, the French Revolution takes place right after the American Revolution. At the same time the Constitution is being established, the French government is being overthrown and replaced by a republic. Everything that happens in the early republic happens in the shadow of the French Revolution. All the foreign policy and everything happens in the shadow of that. Know that Washington's presidency and John Adams' presidency, important. I didn't say very much about them, but they are important. George Washington establishes the nature of the authority of president. George Washington, I should mention, served 2 terms, and that set the pattern for how many terms a president would serve right up until Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s. Adams has to deal with the fallout of the French Revolution, Alien and Sedition Acts. He tries to suppress free speech. It doesn't work. He ends up getting defeated in 1800 by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a number of important things happened during his presidency between 1800 and 1801 and 1809, essentially. Country doubles in size. He gives a bunch of money to Napoleon. Fantastic voyage of exploration. Jefferson, the first to make American military power felt overseas. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, both of their careers come to a crashing halt. Hamilton by death, and Burr by killing. So that's the scene that we're setting now as we move into the War of 1812. So that's the early Republic. Looking at my counter there, I have kept this to 39, 47, 48, 49, 50. It'll be 40, probably 41 minutes when I conclude. If you have any questions, guys, email me. You know, I don't know if I've mentioned that to you guys before, but feel free to contact me directly. Your teachers can answer any obviously simple questions you have, and they can tell you anything I can tell you. But if you do feel a need to contact me, jmummaw, JMUMMAW, at Gray, GRAYCA.com. Contact me, love to hear from you. Hopefully I'll be down to see you guys again really soon. Not sure exactly when, but I'm going to make it happen as soon as possible. I always enjoy coming down and seeing you all. So, thank you all once again for watching. Miss Hahn, Miss McCall, thank you for all the hard work you do. I will see you all later. Have a nice day and enjoy your history.